Don't touch my car. The words rang out sharp enough to slice through the morning air, carrying across the cracked pavement of the industrial district. The voice belonged to Patrick Wright, the billionaire tech titan whose name was whispered in boardrooms and splashed across magazine covers. His tone left no room for interpretation. It was not a request, but a command born from years of entitlement and unchallenged authority. The recipient of those words froze in place, a tall, disheveled black man whose clothes hung loose from nights spent sleeping outdoors. His hair bore the roughness of unkempt days, and a canvas grocery bag slung over his shoulder held all his worldly belongings. He had taken 2 cautious steps toward the hypercar, sleek, silver, and impossibly rare, when the rebuke landed. The onlookers, drawn by the hiss of smoke spilling from the car's rear vents, turned their attention not to the billionaire's plight, but to the stranger who had dared to approach him. Phones lifted into the air, recording. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the small crowd. Some whispered that it was only a matter of time before security arrived. Patrick's hypercar, the Quantum Apex, one of only 17 in existence, was faltering. Blue-gray vapor seeped from its engine housing, a smoke color that suggested something far worse than cosmetic failure. The car's diagnostic screen, glowing faintly on his wrist display, had already issued a countdown. 39 minutes until catastrophic engine damage. A machine worth $4.2 million was dying in real time, and the world was watching. The stranger's voice had carried no menace, only quiet certainty. He had said he knew the problem. He had said he could help. Yet the billionaire's first instinct had been rejection, not out of technical skepticism, but out of prejudice. In his eyes, the man's appearance disqualified him from even being near such technology. That was the moment that sparked curiosity in every witness. How could this homeless man possibly know what was wrong with a proprietary engine system so classified that even company engineers weren't permitted to discuss its specifications publicly? The murmurs in the crowd shifted, their curiosity turning into silent expectation. They were witnessing not just a broken car, but the beginning of something larger, a collision of 2 worlds that rarely acknowledged each other. Patrick pressed his phone to his ear again, pacing, waiting for a service engineer to answer. No luck. Reception here was poor, and even if someone picked up, the nearest authorized service center was hours away. He tapped a number on his security app, thumb hovering above the call button. His instincts screamed for control, for exclusion, for protection. But the stranger remained where he stood, calm, composed, as if waiting for Patrick's pride to exhaust itself. It was in that pause that the true story began. Albert Johnson hadn't always been the man people avoided on sidewalks or dismissed at first glance. Years ago, he had walked corridors of glass towers, whiteboards filled with his equations, teams hanging on his insights. He was an MIT graduate, not once but thrice, 3 degrees in thermal engineering and applied physics. 7 patents bore his name, each one worth millions to the companies that had filed them. His designs had pushed aerospace technology forward, saving lives in high-stress environments where cooling systems made the difference between success and disaster. But brilliance alone had not shielded him from the world's harsher judgments. False accusations, whispered rumors, and the color of his skin combined into a storm that stripped him of contracts, credibility, and eventually employment. Overqualified, hiring managers would say when he tried to return. Not a cultural fit, others muttered when his credentials were undeniable. Behind those words sat the unspoken truth, his address, or lack of one, his unshaven face, his race. To the gatekeepers of corporate halls, he no longer belonged. For 3 years, he had lived between library stacks and shelter bunks, keeping his mind sharp even as his world narrowed. Mornings were disciplined, folding his tarp with military precision, washing at public restrooms, and arriving at the city library by opening time. Knowledge was his tether to a past that seemed to mock him with every missed opportunity. In the evenings, he volunteered, teaching science to children at the shelter. It was in explaining simple concepts, heat transfer, chemical reactions, the miracle of flight, that he found fragments of his old self. And yet, despite everything stripped from him, he remained what he had always been, a problem solver. That morning, when he heard the unfamiliar rhythm of the Quantum Apex engine approaching the industrial strip, he recognized the subtle irregularity immediately. Most people heard a futuristic hum. He heard stress lines forming in an alloy, a fracture predicted years ago in prototype reports that executives had chosen to ignore. He had written those warnings himself, buried in internal memos that gathered dust on forgotten servers. Now, the flaw had surfaced in full view of the world, attached to the reputation of a man who embodied the very system that had once erased him. Albert stepped forward not because he expected gratitude or reward, but because something inside him couldn't ignore a problem that had a solution. He knew the exact smoke signature, the pressure dynamics, the fragile point between secondary and tertiary coolant loops. He could fix it with nothing more than basic tools, steady hands, and the kind of knowledge that doesn't fade even when life tries to grind it into silence. Patrick saw none of that. He saw only a threat. The crowd, however, began to sense more. Their phones captured the tension. Their whispers carried speculation. Why had the homeless man spoken with such certainty? Why had the billionaire bristled so quickly? Why did the stranger remain so composed, as if he knew the countdown ticking in Patrick's wrist display better than Patrick himself? In the next 60 seconds, Patrick's world would tilt. He didn't know it yet, but his judgment, quick, dismissive, absolute, would unravel. Because standing before him was not just a man with worn shoes and tired eyes. Standing before him was the very mind that had once predicted this precise failure. The hypercar's engine hissed louder, the smoke thickened, and the silence of expectation hung over the crowd. Somewhere in that silence, the story of Patrick Wright and Albert Johnson truly began. The morning began as it always did for Albert Johnson, quietly, without witnesses, and with a sense of discipline that no hardship could erase. He awoke before the sun had fully broken through the smog of the industrial district. His makeshift bedding, a faded tarp carefully folded to the same dimensions each day, was tucked beneath a rusted pipe behind an abandoned machine shop. To a passing stranger, it looked like nothing more than discarded trash, but to Albert, it was the closest thing he had to order. Years earlier, his mornings had started differently. Alarms set in glass towers, elevators rising into boardrooms where whiteboards carried his equations, where colleagues waited for his insights to unlock the secrets of heat and pressure. Now, the only waiting was the silence of streets that forgot his name, but Albert still treated the beginning of each day with ritual precision. Structure was the last possession he had managed to keep. He washed his face and hands at the public restroom 2 blocks away. The cracked mirror reflected a man weathered by nights outdoors, but behind the tired eyes, the mind remained alive. He brushed his teeth with an old travel-sized toothbrush, straightened his posture, and walked toward the city library with the quiet dignity of a man who refused to let circumstances decide his worth. Inside the library, Albert became someone else. Surrounded by shelves of books and glowing computer screens, he wasn't the man in worn clothes. He was the engineer who had once stood at the front of auditoriums at MIT, explaining thermal regulation to students who scribbled his formulas with awe. He was the consultant who had presented designs that saved aircraft from overheating at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. The library didn't care that he had no address. It didn't care about rumors, race, or ruined reputations. It only cared that he kept showing up. Here he studied journals left behind in recycling bins, downloaded reports, and pieced together trends in industries that had erased him. He taught himself the latest changes in propulsion, cooling, and fluid dynamics, keeping his knowledge sharp in a world that assumed he had gone dull. The irony was heavy. Albert could recite complex thermodynamic equations from memory, yet he couldn't get past a hiring manager who refused to see past his appearance. Interviewers had called him overqualified, though what they really meant was unwanted. They had muttered, not a cultural fit, though what they truly feared was the uncomfortable mix of brilliance and skin color that defied their neat categories. Years earlier, he had held 3 degrees from MIT, each earned with distinction. He had filed patents worth millions, his name printed on documents that corporations now buried under their logos. He had been invited to conferences where industry giants like Patrick Wright delivered keynotes. They had nearly crossed paths before. Nearly. Then his world had collapsed. A false accusation had spread like wildfire through his company. A prototype failure caused by executives overriding safety protocols had been blamed on him. Investigations later cleared his name, but by then it didn't matter. The rumor had done its work. His reputation was damaged, his contracts withdrawn, his phone silent. Savings dwindled, friends disappeared, each one offering polite excuses for why they couldn't help. The system did the rest. Without an address, there was no phone plan. Without a phone, there were no callbacks. Without callbacks, there was no work. The spiral continued until the man who had designed aerospace cooling systems for billion-dollar companies now folded a tarp behind a machine shop for shelter. And yet, he remained unbroken. He volunteered at the shelter 3 nights a week, teaching children about science. He explained why the sky was blue, why metal expands in heat, why airplanes could fly. The kids didn't know they were being taught by a man once called a genius by the brightest engineers in the country. They only knew that he made science magical, that he cared, and that he treated them with respect. For Albert, those hours mattered more than the silence of the streets. They reminded him he still had value even if the world tried to erase it. That morning, as he walked toward the library, he heard a sound that froze him mid-step. The hum of the Quantum Apex, a sound unlike any other vehicle in existence. Its engine carried a distinctive purr, a harmony of quantum thrust and nano-cooled bearings. Albert recognized it instantly. He had studied its predecessor years ago during his consultancy at Aerotech Industries. He had helped design the prototype cooling systems that made such engines possible. But today, something in the sound was wrong. To most ears, the car still purred. To Albert, the rhythm was uneven, a faint irregularity that only someone deeply familiar with its architecture could detect. He knew before the car even pulled over that something inside it was failing. The flaw was not new. He had warned about it in his old reports. A stress point in the secondary cooling loop, vulnerable to microfractures under repeated thermal load. He had written Memo XT447, highlighting the risk in detail. Executives had dismissed his warnings, choosing to push production forward to meet deadlines and profits. Now, years later, the consequence of their decision hissed into the air in the form of blue-gray smoke. He approached cautiously, his instincts urging him forward despite knowing the likely outcome. Experience had taught him that help wasn't always welcome, especially from a man who looked like him, dressed like him. Too many times he had been met not with gratitude but suspicion, sometimes hostility. Security guards had been called on him for offering to help jumpstart a car. Strangers had clutched their bags tighter when he asked for directions. Every gesture of kindness carried risk. And yet the smoke from the hypercar was growing darker, the crowd gathering larger, and his mind, trained to solve problems, refused to stay silent. He stepped closer, already forming the solution in his head. Patrick Wright stood beside the hypercar, phone pressed to his ear, frustration visible in every line of his posture. His reputation was unraveling in front of strangers with cameras. Albert saw it clearly. This man wasn't just fighting a broken machine, he was fighting the fear of losing control. Albert knew that feeling well. For a brief second, their eyes met. Patrick's gaze held no recognition of the man before him, only dismissal. To Patrick, Albert was a nuisance, another obstacle between him and a solution. But beneath that look, Albert recognized something else, a flicker of doubt, a hesitation that revealed he had heard Albert's words about the cooling system. It was only a moment, but it was enough. Albert understood that sometimes all it took was a single seed of recognition to change the course of a life. The billionaire turned away, pressing his phone harder against his ear. The crowd whispered, the cameras recorded. And Albert, steady and calm, stood in the smoke-filled air, carrying the weight of knowledge unacknowledged, waiting for the moment when desperation might finally open the door that prejudice had slammed shut. The smoke thickened in slow ribbons, curling into the gray sky above the industrial district. The crowd had grown, drawn not by compassion, but by the magnetism of spectacle. Some people stood at a distance, whispering and pointing. Others lifted phones higher, hungry for the kind of clip that could go viral before lunchtime. In the middle of it all, Patrick Wright wrestled with frustration, pacing with his dead phone like a man who had lost control of both machine and moment. Albert remained steady, standing a respectful distance from the hypercar. His eyes traced the thin trail of vapor with the precision of a scientist studying a controlled experiment. Every detail told a story. The color of the smoke revealed coolant contamination. The rhythm of the hiss confirmed pressure loss. The faint vibration through the pavement carried echoes of the secondary loop fighting to stabilize itself. To the crowd, it was just a car in trouble. To Albert, it was a diagnosis unfolding in real time. He knew exactly where the fracture was forming. He had known it years ago when he wrote Memo XT447, an internal report flagging the potential weakness. His words back then had been buried under executive signatures and rushed deadlines. Today, those words had clawed their way back into reality in the most public way possible. He spoke calmly, not to convince the crowd, but to honor the truth of his knowledge. He explained the secondary loop, the stress fracture, the way coolant leaked into the tertiary chamber before vaporizing on contact with thermal shielding. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had lived with this information long before others admitted it existed. At first, Patrick didn't respond. His instinct was defense, not acceptance. Years of being at the top had taught him that authority was something to protect fiercely. Admitting vulnerability, even mechanical vulnerability, was not in his vocabulary. He waved for security, eyes narrowing at the man who dared to explain his million-dollar problem like a teacher correcting a careless student. Two guards stepped closer, forming a wall between Patrick and Albert. Their posture was professional but clear. This man was to be treated as a potential threat, not a source of help. The crowd leaned in, sensing conflict. The cameras tilted. Someone whispered the word tampering, and the narrative began to shift in dangerous ways. Albert didn't flinch. He had seen this wall before, invisible yet solid. It was the same wall that appeared in job interviews when he handed over his resume. The same wall that rose in corporate corridors when his warnings were brushed aside. It was the wall of doubt, built not from evidence but from appearance. Still, he stood with dignity. He didn't shout, he didn't beg. He spoke of the fracture, of the exact location, of the cost if left unrepaired. He gave specifics no random stranger could invent. And when he mentioned memo XT447, Patrick's face betrayed a flicker of recognition. That number wasn't public. That memo had been seen only by engineers and executives buried deep inside Aerotech Industries. For the first time, Patrick hesitated. That hesitation was small, almost invisible, but Albert recognized it instantly. He knew the look of a man who had heard truth, even if pride tried to deny it. But then the reinforcement arrived. A black SUV rolled up, and out stepped another layer of authority, a security chief from the nearby tech campus, flanked by more guards. He carried himself with the polished confidence of someone used to being obeyed. To him, the situation was simple. Valuable intellectual property was exposed, and an unauthorized stranger was standing too close. He dismissed Albert with a glance. His words were coded in professional courtesy, but his tone carried the weight of accusation. Unauthorized. Proprietary, tampering. Each word was a stone added to the wall of doubt. Patrick listened, caught between two voices, the calm expertise of a homeless man who spoke like an engineer, and the polished assurance of a security chief who represented order. Pride leaned toward the latter. Reputation leaned toward caution. The crowd, meanwhile, shifted restlessly. They could smell the drama deepening. Phones shook as people recorded every second, eager to capture the moment the billionaire decided whether to trust the unlikely savior or eject him into the shadows. Albert stood still, unshaken by the swirl of suspicion. He had lived inside that doubt for 3 long years. It no longer surprised him, but it still cut deep. He remembered every interview where his credentials were treated as suspicious. He remembered every sideways glance when his resume seemed too good to be true. Now he was being accused of espionage against a machine partially built from his own forgotten warnings. The irony would have been bitter if he had energy left for bitterness. Instead, he focused on the smoke. The color had deepened, the hiss grown louder. The hypercar was deteriorating faster than Patrick realized. Time was not on his side, and neither were the odds. Albert spoke again, his voice measured, his words simple. The car had less than 40 minutes before catastrophic failure. Repair crews wouldn't arrive in time. A tow would worsen the fracture. The only chance was intervention now at this curb with nothing more than the tools in the emergency kit. Patrick's face tightened. Pride battled with reason. The crowd's whispers sharpened. If the car failed publicly, it would humiliate him far more than admitting this stranger's insight. If the car was saved, however, the world would know it was rescued not by corporate engineers, but by a man he had just dismissed with disdain. It was a battle between ego and survival. The security chief pressed harder, urging Patrick to reject the risk. The guards shifted closer to Albert, ready to escort him away. But Patrick's mind lingered on the mention of XT447. How could this man possibly know something only insiders had read? Finally, Patrick broke the silence, his voice reluctant. He asked what Albert would need to fix the car. The answer was simple: Basic tools, a few adjustments, and 20 uninterrupted minutes. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for resolution. Phones zoomed in. The moment felt balanced on the edge of a knife. Patrick didn't agree. Not yet. He hedged, asking questions, probing for certainty. He ordered the guards to check Albert's ID, to run his name through systems that could only tell part of the story. The results came back bleak. No current address, no employment, a gap in history explained only by an incident years ago. Evidence enough for dismissal, and yet doubt remained. The Hypercar's diagnostic countdown glowed on his wrist. 37 minutes, then 36. The smoke was thicker now, impossible to ignore. Every second brought the truth closer to undeniable. Albert stood silently, watching, waiting, carrying the same dignity he had carried through countless dismissals. He had done his part, spoken the truth, explained the risk, given the solution. Whether Patrick chose to believe was no longer about engineering, it was about pride, prejudice, and the courage to trust what the world had taught him to ignore. The wall of doubt loomed tall, but cracks had already begun to form. The standoff at the curb had reached its peak. The billionaire's car wheezed like a wounded creature, blue-gray smoke curling upward, each hiss from the cooling system a reminder that time was running out. Patrick Wright had placed himself firmly between fear and pride. Fear whispered that his machine was minutes away from ruin. Pride insisted that trusting a man in worn clothes was impossible. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, phones raised, capturing every second of the unraveling scene. Albert Johnson remained still, steady as stone, despite the weight of suspicion pointed at him from every angle. Security guards hovered, their hands resting on radios, ready to end this uncomfortable picture. The security chief stood tall, his polished shoes planted firmly on the pavement, insisting the matter was clear. This was not help, but interference. Words like protocol and proprietary spilled into the air, sterile terms meant to mask the ugly undercurrent. The crowd did not need explanations. They had already decided what they were witnessing. Albert, however, carried something the others did not, the quiet memory of his own work. He had written the warning years ago. XT447, a memo buried under bureaucracy. A number meaningless to most, but to Patrick, it landed like a crack of thunder. He had seen that memo before, tucked in a report that had been brushed aside when deadlines loomed larger than caution. Now the homeless man on the curb had spoken it aloud with perfect clarity. Patrick hesitated. The wall of doubt was not destroyed, but it was shaken. He was trapped in a storm of his own making, an expensive machine failing before his eyes, a crowd ready to turn this into humiliation, and a stranger who knew secrets no outsider should know. The stranger's words would have been dismissed again, buried under pride if not for the name he spoke next. He asked Patrick to make one call, just one, to Eleanor Chen, the chief engineer at Space Tech Industries. For a moment, Patrick froze. That name was not casual. It belonged to one of the most respected engineers in the world, someone whose authority he trusted, someone whose voice carried weight even in boardrooms full of billionaires. If this man truly knew her, if she truly recognized his name, then perhaps the story was different than the one Patrick's eyes told him. The hesitation stretched into silence. Then Patrick, with reluctance heavy in his movements, scrolled through his contacts and made the call. The crowd hushed as if sensing history turning. Phones steadied, lenses sharpened, security guards exchanged uncertain glances, their postures softening. Even the smoke seemed to pause, drifting more gently as the engine fought against its own collapse. The phone rang once, twice, then connected. The speaker was turned on, the billionaire's voice clipped and professional as he explained the situation. He asked if she knew a man named Albert Johnson. The response came like a door opening in a dark room. Eleanor Chen's voice, sharp with disbelief and then warm with recognition, rang through the speaker. Yes, she knew him. He was not just anyone. He was one of the most brilliant thermal engineers she had ever worked with. She described his work, his designs that had saved spacecraft, the very patents still in use at her company. She spoke not with hesitation, but with certainty, her words carrying the authority of someone who had no reason to exaggerate. The crowd reacted instantly. Murmurs swept through like a gust of wind. The guards who had been prepared to push Albert away now stepped back, unsure. The security chief's polished confidence cracked, his certainty replaced with unease. Even Patrick's face changed, the hard lines of dismissal softening into something more complicated. Eleanor's voice grew serious. She told Patrick what Albert had accomplished, how his patents had shaped entire industries, how his mind was invaluable. She did not stop there. She revealed that Albert had been lost to the industry, disappearing without explanation, and that many had wondered where he had gone. Now, standing in the street beside a dying hypercar, he was found again. Her final words left no room for debate. If Albert said he could fix the car, then he could fix the car. Not only that, but he was probably the single most qualified person alive to do it. The weight of that truth landed heavily. Patrick looked at Albert again, but this time his gaze was different. It was not the look he gave a stranger in rags. It was not the look of a man measuring threat. It was the look of a man realizing he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. His mind churned through the contradiction, a homeless figure who carried himself with the precision of an expert, who spoke truths only insiders knew, who was recognized by one of the most respected engineers on the planet. The wall of doubt cracked further, and yet another truth pressed in. Why was this man, this genius, this creator of revolutionary systems, standing here dismissed by society, unseen and unwanted? How had the world failed him so completely? That question lingered at the edges of Patrick's thoughts, though pride kept him from asking it aloud. For Albert, the moment was not triumph, but confirmation. The system that had erased him had also erased the memory of his contributions. Now, in front of strangers, in front of cameras, his identity was spoken back into existence by someone who remembered his worth. It was a small victory, but to him it felt like oxygen after years of suffocating silence. The crowd absorbed every word, their expressions shifting from skepticism to awe. Phones captured the moment, their lenses recording not just smoke and steel, but the collapse of prejudice in real time. The man they had almost written off was revealed to be the very mind behind the technology they marveled at. Patrick's hand dropped from his phone. The conversation ended, but the echoes of Eleanor's words lingered in the air. Silence spread across the gathering, heavy and electric. Everyone waited for Patrick's next move. The billionaire stood in conflict. Pride still tugged at him, warning that trusting this man would expose his own misjudgment. Yet reason whispered louder now. The engine was failing, the countdown was real, and the only hope stood patiently in worn shoes with calm eyes. Albert remained motionless, waiting. His posture carried neither desperation nor arrogance. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. He did not push, he did not plead, he simply existed in the truth of who he was, letting the weight of his identity settle where it belonged. The smoke thickened once more, as if to remind everyone that time would not wait for pride to resolve itself. 30 minutes remained before catastrophic failure. The crowd knew it. Patrick knew it. Albert knew it. And now, after Eleanor Chen's voice cut through the noise, the billionaire no longer had the shield of ignorance. He could not pretend this man was simply a stranger. He could not deny the truth spoken aloud. The door had been opened. What Patrick chose to do next would not only decide the fate of a machine worth millions, but also reveal the kind of man he truly was when stripped of excuses. The air was heavy with expectation. Phones hovered, strangers waited, and in the center of it all stood Albert Johnson, finally recognized, finally seen, standing in the smoke like a quiet storm ready to change everything. The hood of the quantum apex lifted with a slow hiss, a mechanical exhale that revealed its heart to the world. Beneath the sculpted panels lay a labyrinth of polished alloys, nano-cooled tubing, and thrumming circuits, each piece of it gleaming with the arrogance of exclusivity. The crowd drew in closer, as though staring into a forbidden temple. Phones angled downward to capture the exposed secret of wealth and power. To most, it looked like incomprehensible machinery. To Albert Johnson, it was a map he had walked before. The smoke curled from a hairline fracture hidden deep within the secondary loop, exactly where his old warnings had predicted it would appear. His eyes moved with the precision of someone scanning not for possibilities, but for certainties. Years of discipline returned in an instant. The engineer in him, long buried beneath rejection, took control. His hands, though rough from hardship, still remembered the delicate economy of motion learned in laboratories and clean rooms. Patrick hovered nearby, tension written into every line of his face. He wanted control, but had already surrendered it. His wealth could not summon a solution fast enough. His pride had already cost him too much time. He watched as Albert arranged the emergency tools with quiet focus. There was no spectacle in his movements, no theatrics for the cameras, only the calm rhythm of a man returning to his craft. The crowd was silent now. Where there had been mockery and whispers, there was a kind of reverence. People held their breath, sensing they were watching something that was not just mechanical, but human. They saw the paradox. A man society had discarded was now performing an act of mastery that could not be bought. Albert requested little. A flashlight beam was angled where he pointed. A small container from the car's kit was opened at his nod. His instructions were clear, his voice steady, but never commanding. Even in this moment, he carried himself with the humility of one who had learned not to expect obedience. Yet his calm authority created a quiet obedience of its own. Even Patrick's guards, once positioned as barriers, now stood as assistants, holding tools with unsteady hands, uncertain whether they were helping an engineer or serving a lesson. He found the fracture within minutes, a thin line barely visible but deadly to the system. He explained, not to boast, but because teaching was woven into his nature, that pressure at such a point could turn microscopic damage into catastrophic failure. The cameras captured his words, and though many didn't understand the science, they understood the conviction. With graphite from a pencil and polymer sealant from the kit, he created a compound on the curb that no manual had ever described. Years of improvisation, of making do with scraps, had sharpened his creativity. For him, engineering had always been about solutions, not appearances. While others had dismissed him, life had trained him to solve problems with whatever was at hand. He sealed the fracture with surgeon-like precision. His fingers moved unshaken, guided by memory as much as by sight. The hush in the air grew heavier as seconds turned into minutes. Each adjustment he made was deliberate, born of 1,000 rehearsals in his mind, the same mind that once designed systems to withstand the vacuum of space. Now that brilliance was condensed into the space of a curb under the gaze of strangers who would never look at him the same way again. The smoke thinned, the hiss softened. The car responded not with the roar of triumph, but with a steady quietness that spoke of stability returning. The countdown on Patrick's wrist slowed. Critical failure was no longer inevitable. It was retreating, held back by hands that the world had tried to push aside. Patrick leaned closer, disbelief painted across his features. He had watched mechanics in sterile environments, engineers in white coats, but never had he seen someone transform a handful of everyday items into salvation for a machine worth more than houses. His pride had no language for this. His mind whispered excuses, luck, coincidence, temporary fix. But his eyes saw something undeniable. Genius. Albert wiped his hands on a cloth, his movements calm and methodical. He did not look around for applause. He did not acknowledge the phones recording his every step. His focus remained on the system until he was satisfied it was safe, even in temporary form. Only then did he step back, his posture quiet, his face unreadable. The crowd erupted, not in wild cheering, but in the stunned murmurs of people who knew they had witnessed something rare. Some clapped hesitantly, others gasped aloud. A woman whispered that it was a miracle. A man muttered that this should not be possible. Children leaned on their parents, asking questions their guardians could not answer. Patrick felt the weight of every eye on him. Moments earlier, he had dismissed this man with scorn. Now the world had seen his dismissal, recorded it, preserved it. The same world had also seen who Albert truly was, a mind too powerful to be ignored, a talent too real to be hidden by circumstance. The billionaire extended his hand, hesitant at first, then firm. The gesture was not born from custom, but from necessity. For once, it was not the power of money extending downward, but the recognition of worth reaching upward. Albert accepted it with the same calm dignity he had carried from the beginning. His expression did not gloat. He had not come for validation. He had come because a problem needed solving, and solving problems was still his nature. The hypercar's engine purred again, quieter, restrained but alive. The diagnostic display confirmed what Albert already knew. The fracture was sealed, pressure stabilized, power limited but safe. The car would survive until proper service could replace what he had repaired on the curb. To the cameras, it was a victory. To Patrick, it was revelation. To Albert, it was simply another day of doing what he had always done, turning knowledge into salvation, even when the world insisted on overlooking him. But beneath the calm surface of his actions, something deeper stirred. The moment was larger than one repair. It was a reminder that brilliance could not be erased, that truth could not be buried forever. The crowd had not only witnessed a man fixing a machine, they had seen the injustice of a genius forced into invisibility, revealed in a single act of undeniable proof. As Albert stepped back, the smoke fully gone, silence hung for one last moment before the crowd began to buzz again. The world had shifted, though no one yet knew how far. Patrick's hypercar was alive, but so too was something more powerful. The recognition of a man society had tried to forget. And for the first time in years, Albert felt not just like a problem solver, but like a man whose voice had been heard. The car was alive again, though not at full strength. Its hum was steady, its smoke gone, its system stable. Around the hypercar, the crowd slowly broke into conversation, the way people do when they know they've seen something rare but are unsure how to put it into words. Some whispered with awe, others shook their heads in disbelief, and nearly every phone stayed raised, unwilling to miss even a second more. Patrick Wright felt the silence inside himself most of all. He had stood at the center of the storm, pride clinging to him like armor, and watched it melt in front of cameras. The man he had dismissed as irrelevant had not only been right, but had rescued him from humiliation that could have spiraled far beyond one broken machine. Patrick's mind, trained for strategy and competition, worked quickly. He knew the story would spread online before the hour was done. He also knew the story would not paint him as the hero. Albert, however, seemed untouched by the swirl of attention. He had not performed for applause, and he did not linger to bask in it. His eyes carried a different weight, one of a man who had solved a problem and now stood at the edge of another. He wiped his hands, returned the tools carefully to their case, and folded the cloth with the same discipline he gave to every part of his life. The calmness unsettled Patrick more than the smoke had. The billionaire's investor meeting pressed heavily against the clock. There was little time, yet his thoughts were already reshaping. If Albert could repair what the manufacturer said was unfixable in the field, what else could he do? And how had such a man been left to wander the streets, invisible to the world that so desperately needed minds like his? The questions dug at Patrick's pride, but they would not leave him. He insisted that Albert come with him. The invitation was awkward, not born of charity, but of curiosity mixed with guilt. He wanted answers, but he also wanted redemption for himself, and perhaps for the image of himself that would soon appear across social feeds. For Albert, the offer was unexpected. He had been trained by experience not to trust such gestures, yet there was something in Patrick's tone that suggested this was not pity. It was opportunity. An opportunity, rare as it was, could not be ignored. Within an hour, Albert's appearance changed. At a boutique Patrick arranged, his worn clothes were replaced with a tailored suit, charcoal in color, cut to his frame with a precision that reminded him of his days walking into conference rooms with his head high. His beard was trimmed, his hair styled. The reflection staring back at him in the mirror seemed like a ghost of his former life, resurrected in fabric and polish. Yet beneath the fine clothing, he was still the man who had folded tarps each morning and carried knowledge like a hidden weight. Patrick, standing nearby, studied him not as a project, but as a puzzle finally taking shape. He realized that if this man walked into any boardroom, he would command respect instantly. The tragedy was that society had needed the disguise of fine clothes to recognize the dignity Albert had carried all along. They traveled together to Nexus Innovations headquarters, the heart of Patrick's empire. The building's glass walls reflected the city's skyline, a monument to ambition and success. Employees in crisp attire moved quickly through the lobby, their eyes widening at the sight of the stranger beside their CEO. They did not know the story yet, but they sensed something unusual. In the conference room, the air was different. Investors, dressed in wealth as much as in fabric, shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. They expected to hear about the next great leap in thermal regulation for quantum computing, not to meet the man who had just saved their leader from public embarrassment. Patrick introduced Albert not as a guest, but as someone whose insights were invaluable. The room grew quiet as Albert sat, his posture straight, his expression calm. He did not rush into speech. He listened as the presentation began, slides filled with numbers, diagrams, and promises of efficiency. He studied each line with the same intensity he had given the broken hypercar. When the investors turned toward him, curious about his thoughts, he spoke without flourish. He pointed out 3 flaws in the design, flaws small enough to be overlooked, yet dangerous enough to cause massive failures later. He suggested solutions that were not complicated but elegant, drawn from years of experience and a mind that had never stopped working. He sketched modifications on a notepad, simple lines that translated into millions of dollars in savings and years of competitive advantage. The room shifted. Investors who had been polite became captivated. Their questions grew sharper, but Albert's answers remained steady. He spoke of efficiency gains, of cost reductions, of ways to improve the system by 34% with less expense. He explained not with arrogance, but with clarity, making even the most complex principles sound simple. For the first time in years, Albert was not invisible. He was not dismissed. He was not reduced to the state of his clothes or his address. He was heard. The meeting stretched far beyond its schedule, and by the end, investors who had entered with skepticism left with commitment. They pledged increased funding, their faces alight with the thrill of opportunity. Patrick watched with quiet astonishment. What had begun as a disaster for his reputation had turned into one of the most remarkable displays of genius he had ever witnessed. When the room finally emptied, Patrick sat across from Albert. He confessed, with a tone softer than before, that what he had seen today was extraordinary. He offered a position, consulting at first, then more if Albert wanted it. But Albert did not respond with eagerness. He spoke instead of the bigger truth, that his story was not unique, that others, too, lived in shelters and on streets, their brilliance buried under the weight of prejudice and circumstance. He pulled from his pocket folded sheets of paper, worn from handling, filled with sketches of patents and designs he had made in library corners and on discarded scraps. He laid them on the table, not as a plea, but as proof. They were ideas far ahead of their time, drawn in the margins of survival. Patrick's breath caught as he scanned them. Each one held the potential to transform industries. Each one was evidence that society had wasted years of brilliance because it had failed to look beyond appearance. Albert spoke with passion, but his voice remained calm. He told Patrick that what mattered was not his redemption alone, but the chance to build something larger, an innovation center that would seek out hidden talent, overlooked genius, people written off by systems too blind to see their worth. A place where the next Albert Johnson would not be left behind. Patrick listened, and for once, he did not interrupt. The arrogance that had once shielded him was gone. In its place was respect, genuine, unshakable respect. In that room, among papers and projections, two men who had begun the day as opposites sat as equals, the billionaire humbled, the homeless engineer finally seen. And though the investors left with promises of profit, what remained on the table was something greater, the possibility of change, the blueprint of a world where genius was never wasted again. The investor meeting ended, but the energy in the room lingered like static after a storm. Chairs were pushed back, papers gathered, voices lowered, but no one quite wanted to leave. They had seen something far more significant than numbers on a screen. They had witnessed a mind return from the shadows, a man who had walked in from the street and transformed the course of their work in less than an hour. Patrick Wright stayed seated, his gaze fixed on the folded sketches Albert had laid on the table. The pages were worn, edges curled from being folded and unfolded countless times. Yet on those creased sheets lived blueprints that could change industries. Elegant designs for cooling networks, energy systems, and neural frameworks sat beside one another, the kind of work research teams spent years and millions chasing. To Patrick, the fact that these had been created in library corners on discarded paper was more shocking than their brilliance. Albert sat quietly across the table, not waiting for applause or offers. He had never sought either. His mind was steady, his posture calm, as if he had already accepted that genius alone was not enough to shift the weight of a world so quick to look away. He had presented his truth. Whether others chose to honor it was beyond his control. Patrick finally spoke, his words carrying a new humility. He offered positions, titles, compensation, attempts to bridge the gulf between what Albert had given and what society had denied him. But Albert shook his head gently. His voice was calm when he explained that what he wanted was not just a place for himself, but a door for others. He spoke of the shelter where he had taught children, of the men and women he had met who carried knowledge unrecognized because their clothes were worn or their histories complicated. He described scientists who once worked in labs now reduced to silence, engineers who had designed systems now dismissed as unhirable, innovators buried beneath circumstance. He carried their stories with him, and in that room, he gave them a voice. Patrick listened, feeling the weight of a truth he had never considered. He had always seen talent through the lens of polished resumes and curated references. He had trusted institutions to deliver him the brightest minds. Now he realized how narrow that pipeline had been, how many lives had been discarded not for lack of brilliance, but for lack of recognition. Albert unfolded more pages from his pocket, diagrams drawn with pencil and care. He laid them out across the table until the mahogany surface was covered. Each design came with an explanation of what had inspired it. One sketched while teaching children how to transfer heat between 2 cans of water. Another imagined after seeing condensation drip from a broken air conditioner vent in a shelter. Another sparked by the quiet patterns of wind against the abandoned machine shop where he slept. Life itself had been his laboratory. The investors had already left, but Patrick stayed, leaning closer to study the fragile sheets. His eyes widened as he recognized the possibilities hidden in the rough lines, systems more efficient than anything his teams had yet produced, solutions to problems they had only begun to understand. But Albert's words were not about patents or profit. He spoke instead of what those sketches represented. They were proof that brilliance could survive even when stripped of status, that knowledge could persist even in silence. Yet they were also proof of waste, years lost, opportunities missed, because society had decided not to look past surface judgments. He proposed an idea that felt larger than the room itself. An innovation center, a place not just for building technology, but for rebuilding lives. It would search for talent where no one bothered to look. It would give resources to those written off, provide space for minds who had been discarded, and offer them the dignity of recognition. It would not be charity, but partnership. The world needed their ideas, and those ideas needed a home. Patrick sat back, stunned by the clarity of the vision. It was not revenge Albert sought, not even personal redemption. It was transformation. The billionaire realized then that the true genius across the table was not only in the formulas and diagrams, but in the courage to imagine a system that valued human potential over prejudice. The weight of the day settled on Patrick's shoulders. Hours earlier, he had shouted at this man to stay away from his car. He had nearly called the police on the very mind that had just saved him, not only his machine, but his reputation. The cameras had recorded everything, and the story would spread, but what struck him most was the quiet dignity Albert had maintained through it all. Not once had he shouted, demanded, or cursed. He had stood calm, patient, and unshaken, as if he had known that truth would eventually reveal itself. Patrick extended his hand again, but this time it was not to thank or hire, it was to agree. The partnership was not between a billionaire and a homeless man, but between 2 equals, one with resources, one with vision. Together they could build the center Albert imagined. For Albert, the handshake was not victory but beginning. He had lived years invisible, carrying ideas no one wanted to hear. Now, for the first time, he felt the possibility that those ideas could breathe, not for his sake alone, but for countless others still waiting in silence. The day faded into evening, the city lights glowing against the glass of the conference room. The hypercar sat safely in the garage, repaired enough to survive, but it no longer felt like the focus. The true repair had taken place elsewhere. A bridge had been built between 2 worlds, one of privilege and one of struggle, and through it walked the possibility of change. News of the curbside repair began to spread online. Videos surfaced, headlines appeared, clips of Albert speaking calmly about the fracture replayed across feeds. Comments poured in, some shocked, some ashamed, many inspired. Strangers debated how such a man could be homeless. Others admitted their own prejudice, confessing that they too would have dismissed him. The story struck deeper than a viral spectacle. It carried a truth too heavy to ignore. By midnight, the name Albert Johnson had begun to appear not in whispers but in headlines. For years, it had been buried under silence. Now it resurfaced, tied not to scandal, but to brilliance, resilience, and justice. But Albert did not watch the screens or track the comments. He walked instead to the shelter, as he always did, where children waited for their evening science lessons. He carried the same quiet smile, the same steady posture. To them, he was still the man who made science magical, who showed them that heat could move and light could bend. They did not know yet that the world outside had finally begun to see what they had always known, that genius is not defined by circumstance, but by spirit. For Patrick, the lesson of the day would never leave him. He had started his morning as a man who believed he could judge worth with a glance. He ended it as a man humbled, holding sketches that might change the future, given to him by someone he had once dismissed. His hypercar had been saved, but more importantly, his perspective had been broken open and rebuilt. The story of that day would travel far, told in headlines and whispered in classrooms, passed between strangers, as proof that extraordinary minds can be hidden in plain sight. But the real story was simpler. A car had been repaired, yes, but more than that, a man had been restored to visibility. And through that restoration, a vision for countless others had been born. Brilliance had survived, waiting for the moment the world could no longer look away.